Hey, this is LOA Today, the Law of Attraction show. Welcome to LOA Today. Walt Thiessen and Joel Elston here. It is Thursday, January the 12th, 2017. We continue this week with our ongoing discussion of Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, and we're up to Chapter 6. This is actually our 5th episode, but Chapter 6 is, it's a topic that any 5-year-old knows very well. It's the topic of imagination, which kind of makes sense that you would include that in a story about how to think and grow rich, because if you can't imagine anything, you can't get anywhere. But fortunately, Joel, we've been given fertile imaginations, and if we just practice them, we can learn to develop them.
Well, the basic concept of the law of attraction is what you believe or what you imagine can happen if you believe it deeply enough. So the idea that we begin by thinking it, feeling it, imagining it, visioning it, visualizing it. When the workshop of the mind is the right under imagination in Chapter 6 is sort of the subtopic.
Okay,
Yeah, and the workshop of the mind, it's where everything begins. And you've heard the statement that everything was created by just a person thinking about something. And the Windows, the computer revolution with Windows and Apple, that was people thinking, imagining what it could be like. And when they were describing their imagination, what they envisioned, people laughed at them and ended up working out pretty good for them.
It's a funny thing, too, because on the one hand, Steve Jobs, who, of course, co-founded Apple, was one of the pioneers in imagining things. And on the other hand, he was a thief. I mean, the original Apple desktop was stolen from Xerox.
The vision when you hear about, there were some early interviews that I've watched with Bill Gates, and he one day said, and how you got to go back in time. It seems of course he knew this was going to happen. But they were talking about computers in the household, and they said, he said, Windows will make there will be a computer in every household, and one day people will just be able to hit a few buttons and stuff will be brought to them. And there was an interview where he said that. He said that every household. He said I envision a day when there's more computers in households than televisions. And of course, the interviewer was like laughing and saying that that's not possible. And then he took it further and said one day that will go everywhere with us. And the interviewer was like, okay, and sort of laughed and moved on. Well, we sort of have gotten there.
Oh, yeah. Well, sort of. I mean, we live in the smartphone age. It does go with us everywhere.
Right. Well, and I'm very interested. Within a few years, I imagine there's going to be more computers in households than. And when I mean computers, counting the smartphones and people using them. I know my foster son, and he's 11, and several of his buddies that I've gotten to know. They all have smartphones. They access entertainment differently. Television is not a big thing to them at all anymore.
No.
Except to play their video games on a TV screen, they don't really care about normal television. They access everything via the internet. They watch TV on their phones.
And I would say that's actually a good thing in a number of different ways, not the least of which it's about time that the TV industry woke up and said, hey, wait a minute, we're in trouble here, and it probably has something to do with the way we've been behaving. But putting that aside, the fact that kids are finding through their interconnectivity online new ways of looking at the world and of understanding themselves within the context of that world and so forth, I think it's terrific.
Yes, and I've find it fascinating going along the idea of imagination, how if used properly, we have access to have our imagination even greater, because I was talking to a young man the other day, a new client, and he is really buying into the law of attraction. He has a very difficult past and a lot of addictive issues, and so he came into my office and he said, I said, how's your week been? He said, amazing. He said, I let's see, I floated down the Amazon River this week.
Ooh.
I was like, well, I just saw you like 3 days ago. I mean, let's see, what happened? He said, I found this great interactive travel app for the phone where you literally, with virtual reality now, can ride down the Amazon River.
Amazing.
And he said, I really believed I rode down the Amazon River. And he said, once I understood that, and he was telling me how his epiphany this week, how he convinced himself by watching an animation, or not an actual film, but very high def, that virtual reality is incredible.
Right.
He really went down the Amazon. His experience was, I went down the Amazon River. He said, if I took a lie detector, I think I would pass because I believe I went down the Amazon River.
Which is that's the essence of imagination, because when you imagine in great detail, your mind and your body really can't tell the difference between the thing that you're imagining and the real thing.
Well, and that's what his belief system is now turning to. And he said, you've given me that with the law of attraction. And I took it further and said, well, now if you could do that with the other areas of your life, if you really are a successful person, if you really start to buy into that, you really start to believe you went down the Amazon, what does the rest of your life look like when you imagine it the way you want it to be? And that's how we break down imagination in the law of attraction.
Now, in the chapter, Hill talks about what he calls two forms of imagination, the first one being synthetic and the second form being creative. And synthetic, actually, it kind of flashes me back to that stupid joke I made a few minutes ago about how Apple stole their technology from Xerox, which has some degree of truth to it, although, that kind of sharing of information happens all the time. And ironically, of course, Steve Jobs got all bent out of shape because you mentioned Bill Gates. He stole the same technology from Apple. So,
well, yeah, it worked out well, didn't it?
It did. It worked out very well. But you can also not look at it as stealing. You can look at it as simply it's old information and other people are using it. And if you look at it that way, that's what synthetic imagination is. Synthetic imagination, as defined by Hill, he says it this way: through this faculty, one may arrange old concepts, ideas, or plans into new combinations. This faculty creates nothing. It merely works with the material of experience, education, and observation with which it is fed. It is the faculty used most by the inventor. Interesting point right there. With the exception of the genius who draws upon the creative imagination when he cannot solve his problem through synthetic imagination. Well, I mean, we can put questions about intellectual property aside for a moment and just recognize that's really what they were doing. They were using other people's ideas and turning them into something new and better.
Well, and that's what we're doing today. You and I are doing.
True.
We are taking information that has been around in the beginning of the previous century, and we're now applying additional information to it. And what happened when Napoleon Hill wrote this book, we praise it every week, and it's an incredible book, but we are also applying some of the new stuff, the epigenetics, the idea of sort of the science behind what he was saying. He said all this stuff, and he had no science behind it. And now there's science coming to back this up. So we're combining the two. So we're combining old information, new information, and moving forward.
Which is really cool. I mean, the fact that he was able to envision all this stuff without knowing any science behind it, and he was right. I mean, that's almost Einsteinian, because that's what Einstein did.
That's what it is. Yeah, that's who I compare him to, and I hope one day he gets credit on the level that Einstein does. That he took something on a theory that was later proved to be exactly right, and that recently, when I say recently, the last 10 years, you every few months it's like, boy, this even proves Einstein's theory even more in depth. Mm-hmm. And I believe we're going to have the same thing with Napoleon Hill.
It'll probably take longer because there certainly has been a lot more resistance to the ideas he put out there. I mean, in a sense, he built on Einstein. I don't know if he actually read Einstein. If he may have been aware of Einstein's theories. I really don't know. But certainly a lot of what he talks about kind of takes Einsteinian theory of relativity, especially the special theory of relativity, to an extreme, if you will. And, I mean, Einstein's theory itself was controversial. It was mind-bending, and most people didn't even understand it at first. So taking that and then taking it to an extreme, that's woo-woo land.
It is. It is. I love it in the sense that, pretty much like we were talking in the beginning about Bill Gates giving an interview of all these things that one day will take place, and they've come true.
Right.
It's Napoleon Hill takes that to even a much further level. And as much as I think Bill Gates and Steve Jobs and IBM and all these people over the years sort of fed off of each other's information, I truly believe Napoleon Hill stuff is one of the greatest discoveries of the history of humanity. But as you're saying, the reluctance or the resistance to it is much more than the other stuff.
And interestingly enough, he used the same concept of synthetic imagination, because that's how he put his book together.
Yes, of course, and that's the point of synthetic imagination, and that, again, we do that weekly. I do that daily in my life. I share, and you know me, I'm always studying stuff and always researching, great new ideas, and they're almost always attached to the law of attraction.
Yep.
And I've had the privilege of speaking with a great doctor, Dr. Daniel Amen. He does a lot of brain work, and I am actually doing some training underneath him right now to become certified in some of his practices. Oh. And I find it amazing. Again, he does mainly scientific research on the brain, but yet comes to a lot of our same conclusions from a purely biological brain standpoint, and that's exciting to me.
Yeah.
It really is.
Yeah.
It really is.
I can see that, because it's one thing. What you've done is really quite unique in its own right. You combined psychotherapy and law of attraction theory, and I don't know of anybody else who's done that. There may be somebody out there who's done it. I don't know them. So from my perspective, that's fairly unique. Now what you're trying to do is take that to the next level before it's even caught on and become a big thing. And I think what you've come up with will become a big thing in psychotherapy circles. Give us about 20, 30 years, and I think it'll become huge. But it's not anywhere near there yet, and yet you're already forging ahead beyond that. I think that's really cool.
Well, and part of what we were talking about is the Amen clinics. If you ever want to look him up, Amen. I don't know his website, but Dr. Daniel Amen, and he very much was talking about the different brain. He does scans of the brain. And he can identify, he's done hundreds of thousands of scans of brains, and he can look at a brain scan and tell you exactly what's wrong with the person by looking at the brain scan.
Wow.
It's amazing. And
by what's wrong with, you don't mean like he's got cancer or something, you mean psychologically.
Oh, psychologically, yeah, certainly. The cancer stuff's easy. Oh, yeah, there's a big lump in the brain. It's this kid has ADHD, or this kid has this, or this kid has attention deficit, and separating the two, the non-hyperactivity disorder, just the inattentive disorder. He can break it down to whatever. This kid's schizophrenic. This is post-traumatic stress syndrome. He's amazing.
It is amazing.
And by looking at the brain, he then knows what recommended tools to take, whether it's medication, whether it's, no matter what. He was telling me about one particular brain in the law of attraction. He knows my belief in the law of attraction. And he said randomly that at first he'd heard that because he's, again, strictly a scientist, until he saw how the brain responded when the brain believed something. And then he realized the brain can heal itself when the thoughts heal itself. And he actually floated the idea that I've discussed in the past, that traumas can be erased by rethinking or reviewing the trauma. And I've used the example for me many times about how eating out of a trash can was a trauma in my addictive state, and going to jail was a trauma during my addiction, versus now where I view they were necessary events. And his theory, which we're going to one day prove, is once you make that leap, because traumas do leave a mark on the brain, and he believes that once you see them differently, that mark on the brain that scar on the brain or whatever, will eventually disappear and no longer be permanent.
Well, that's both encouraging and not totally surprising, I have to say.
It's not to us, for sure.
Because, we know from experience that you can effectively erase stuff from your own mind by basically replacing it with something else.
Right.
So we know that that does work, and it can take time. I mean, especially if there's a trauma involved, it can take a lot of time. But if you're persistent about it and you just keep rewriting on your mind, on your brain, on your mind, the thing that you want to adopt as the new thought pattern, the old thought pattern does tend to go away over time. So intuitively, I can tell that, yeah, it makes sense.
Right. Well, and that's where this is what we do. This is what you and I do every week in some form or fashion. But the fact that we can sort of start pulling all this together is something very, when you first hear it and it's strictly a woo-woo, the people say, okay, you all you got to do is change your mindset and everything changes instantly. Well, I actually believe that. However, it isn't just simply wishing, or it isn't just simply sitting in your chair saying it has to be a full, all-on commitment in the belief of it all. And that's where the imagination thing becomes so valuable.
Yes.
If you don't believe it, it can't take place. If you truly believe it, it has no option but to take place.
That's why I actually like to say that wishful thinking really does work, because when you just express a wish, you're not really thinking about it. But if you wish in combination with thinking, that's where you have to put the effort in. That's where you have to really kind of bring it all together and focus and all that stuff. And that's when it starts to really work.
Completely. And that's traditionally is where most people have the hardest time, because we spend a lifetime believing a certain thing, or spend a lifetime being poor or struggling with money. And using that one example, that's what most people seem to get stuck on.
Oh, yeah.
And so they're struggling. So even though they're trying the technique, it takes a while for them to do it. It could be in an instant, but it's never in an instant, because that person truly, even though they're imagining it, they're not imagining it sort of an all-in imagination.
Oh, right, exactly. In fact, I was just telling you before we did this week's show about a new friend who I acquired online, who is a serial entrepreneur, extremely successful. And he was telling me how whenever he makes a new fortune, he'll buy a company and he'll flip the company and make millions of dollars off it, or that kind of thing. He gives all the money away, which you and I would kind of like, okay, well, if that's what he wants to do. But he does it for a reason. He does it to get himself back into that state of being on the edge so that he can get that focus back. And while it's not, that's pretty extreme, I certainly don't recommend it. I don't really want to do it myself that way, but at least I can understand why he's doing that. It does at least make sense.
Right, and that desperate mindset. I have a young man who I've been working with, and I found his attitude, and I'm working on it. I found it interesting. He, at the beginning of December, he came to me, and he had failed out of school, had some drug issues, and he was a football player, and he came to me and he was very hungry, and we started working on his mindset and the law of attraction. He started buying into it. And our goal at the beginning of this was hopefully by next June or somewhere along the way, he would be able to be accepted into a new school and start playing football again. Mm-hmm. And we had an entire sort of a rehabbing his mind, a rehabbing his reputation, a whole bunch of things planned. And he was all in. He was in the gym every morning. He was eating properly. He had the great mindset. It was very gung-ho. He was very excited. So shockingly, he was given an offer not for June, for January.
Wow.
And he just, and I was like, oh my gosh, this worked faster than I even possibly could have imagined. And so the fact he brought that, it was great. However, the moment he was accepted, his attitude went back to the old way.
Really?
Yeah. He quit getting up and going to the gym. He quit doing these things. He still has the offer, and he's still planning on leaving next week to go to school. However, it's a very nebulous situation, it's a very fragile situation right now. I don't think it's going to work, because he's back in that old mindset. I hope it does.
Yeah.
But I'm seeing it. He's a different person. That happens a lot. People, and that's what your friend's doing, is he is getting on. He gives everything away to develop that state of stress. I see people do that a lot. It's very effective for a few. but it also creates a lot of chaos for most others.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, I don't know this guy well enough to know for sure that there are any symptoms or whatever. But like you say, it's stress. When you create stress for yourself, I don't care how you look at it. Medical science tells us, psychology tells us, the spiritual realm tells us, stress kills you. And
yes.
You're setting yourself up. I mean, if that's really the way you want to live, then fine, but just recognize what you're doing. You really don't have to go to that extreme in order to attract what you want to attract into your life, in order to, do the things that you want to do with your life, in order to live abundantly and all that kind of stuff. You don't have to go that crazy, but if you choose that path, you just have to recognize, okay, I'm kind of setting myself up in a different way, and maybe I will be able to use that edge to accomplish what I'm trying to accomplish, but I may pay a price for it.
Well, and that's the piece that we're trying to do. And I don't want to specifically talk about your friend because I don't know him, but I will tell you about people that I know that get into addictive patterns with that same theory of. I happen to believe addiction for many people. There's an addiction to depression. There's an addiction to chaos. Procrastination has an addictive component to it because it's like, let me put it off to the last minute, then I'll successfully do it. I don't know how many people say I work better under pressure. I wait to the last minute to do things, and then I have to do them.
Oh, yeah.
And that's great. But I challenge the theory that long term, that is not always the best way to be successful.
Yeah, well, I would say that it's just not terribly healthy.
Right. And so while getting ourselves and setting ourselves up to get into that mindset, I prefer to be able to create that vortex or that thought process without putting myself in a hyper stress state where it's hanging on. Again, I'm not talking about your friend in particular. And I know that I've told you about this thing that I've done for years is in my checking account, I like to have a certain amount of money. Mm-hmm. So there was a time where my goal was to have $1,000 that was just there. I was going to call that zero. That was ground level. Nothing was going to go. I would just zero it out at 1,000, and then there's that backup of $1,000.
Right.
And then I eventually got to where I wanted to keep $5,000 in my checking account, and I would call that zero. And then there's another level and another level. And once you get there, it isn't a negative about looking at it as zero, but it's just a nice backup. And then when I get to it, and I've been able to do that at each level, and it's very comforting that there's a backup there. But that doesn't take my edge away. I haven't slowed down because I have that backup. I just view it as that's sort of me I need to keep it there. That keeps my edge going. I've always said I wouldn't, I don't play the lottery because I am a compulsive gambler and I don't want to, that's just part of what I don't do.
Sure.
But if I were to be given or awarded or won some kind of contest and were given $100 million, on some level, of course, everybody, that would be great. But I would do a lot of things, real philanthropic, give a lot of it away. I would help a lot of people, but I want to keep my edge. I need to work because I love what it does for me. I love how I feel. I love my life. I love everything about my life. I have plenty of money, but I also don't want to ever be at a point where it's an option just to not do anything because I don't like that feeling either.
And the whole point here is that whether you have to give it all away in order to get that edge or whether you have to sock money away in order to get that edge doesn't really make any difference which it is. The point is the edge is where you are no longer thinking about money. You're simply focusing on what it is that you enjoy doing.
That's the answer. And when we get to that place, when your friend gets to that place, there's all kinds of tools mentally we can use. And I think that's sort of when we're talking about, we talked about the synthetic imagination that Napoleon Hill speaks of.
Right.
It is, I operate very well with the synthetic imagination piece. I do well at that. love to take old concepts and see how I love the fact that the law of attraction actually goes way back in some ancient Chinese texts.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing that some of this stuff is 2,000 and 3,000 years old, and at least, and it's very relevant. So I love the fact of taking old stuff and then and adapting it and seeing this theory forward. My creative imagination has. I love to use creative imagination, but I've never been as effective at it as synthetic, and I don't know why, but synthetic's easier for me.
Well, I agree with you. I have very much the same experience, and I think the thing about creative imagination, first of all, what is creative imagination? I mean, he defines that fairly well, too, in his book, but it's basically the part where you are opening yourself up to hunches and inspirations that come from you're not really sure where. I mean, here's the way he describes it. Through the faculty of creative imagination, the finite mind of man has direct communication with infinite intelligence. It is the faculty through which hunches and inspirations are received. It is by this faculty that all basic or new ideas are handed over to man. So there's a sort of a spiritual component there, but more importantly, it's about the hunches, the inspirations, the stuff that just kind of comes to you. And I think we've all experienced that on one level or another at various times in our lives. I suspect most of us never really thought about it in terms of, it was coming from the other side or from spirit or the universe or whatever. But, regardless of how you look at it, you can fit it into your religious beliefs, whatever your religious beliefs might be. But again, however you look at it, the important thing is being open to it. Because the process of being open to it is the process of developing it. And I have to say, I want to develop the creative imagination more than I want to develop the synthetic imagination. Partly because it's a weakness for me, it's the weaker one, and partly because that's where the really cool stuff happens.
Yes, well, and I love the creative imagination. I love the concept of the hunches, and I discovered the law of attraction through hunches. So I mean, it can be a blend of the two, because I didn't know what I was looking for until I found it. And I instinctively knew the law of attraction existed. I just didn't. We talked before. I mean, I was 12 years old when I was realizing what I was being taught spiritually was silly, and I said, I'm sorry. I'm not disrespecting what you guys believe, but it's not. It's crazy.
Yeah, it was 14 for me, but yeah, about the same time.
Yeah, and I spent really from my 12th year of trying to figure it out. Until I believe it was well into, I think my mid-30s is when so that's a long time of that pursuit. But the moment I found it, I knew it was real. So that at that point, I can often see where the creative imagination can eventually lead you to a place that then you combine the synthetic imagination and take it further. I mean, I know that sounds sort of odd, but they can work together is my point.
Oh, I don't think it's odd at all. I think you're accurate. I think you're dead on, because they can work together. It's not like one is exclusive of the other.
Exactly.
And we talked about Steve Jobs before. I mean, perfect example is we mentioned the smartphone, the iPhone that he created. Well, that was a combination of creative and synthetic imagination. I mean, he used a lot of the ideas synthetically from the earlier years of the computer revolution. But he also introduced ideas like, being able to take pictures on your telephone.
Yes.
That was brand new. No one had ever come up with that one before. And the first time people thought about it, a lot of people said, why on earth would you want to take pictures with your telephone? The 35 millimeter is going to be so much higher resolution.
I remember very distinctively. I have a friend that worked, and I forget the name of the camera company. They used to have a shop in every mall. I mean, they were very famous. And he was a manager of one of these camera stores. And I remember when the period came out when you were able to take pictures with your phone. And I remember mentioning to him, I said, it seems to me that would be the area you would want to focus on now, because I imagine one day there won't be any regular cameras. There wouldn't be any need for them. And he went on this tirade about, oh my goodness, those poor quality pictures on the phone, and they'll never match the resolution of a high definition camera, blah blah blah, with all this stuff. And he said that's why that'll never go away. Well, all those stores are closed now. There's no more of those stores around,
right?
And they could never imagine that you can make a picture as dense and as high def as you want now. I mean, you can make it ridiculous and make it rich and vibrant and do whatever you want to it in a way a film would never do. So the idea you can't imagine it, but other people do. And seeing that years ago, I mean, how many devices has our phone replaced? I mean,
it's crazy.
I have. You don't need a GPS. You don't need a camera. You don't need a watch. You don't need a calculator. You don't need multiple. There's just so many things you don't need anymore because it's all right here in your phone.
Right. Yeah, and on top of that, you talked about what the camera maker or the camera shop owner mistakenly believed. I mean, what it came down to was camera people at the time believed that the best resolution came about because of your lens. And what Steve Jobs and others proposed was, no, the lens isn't the most important thing. The important thing is how much data are you capturing. So
yes.
He just wanted to put in chips that would capture gigantic amounts of data. And sure enough, the original iPhone with the original selfie capability built in, the original little camera, was not terribly high resolution. But today, I mean, the resolution on these things rivals what you can find on a high-end digital camera. This doesn't mean that there is no role for the lens. The lens certainly does help, and that's why a professional photographer still wants to buy a digital camera with a high-quality lens and so forth, because they can get so much better control over what it is that they're taking a picture of. But for the average Joe who doesn't need that high level of precision, the amount of pixels that are in his iPhone are plenty. They're more than enough than what he needs, and it works beautifully.
Absolutely. I often see on the news where, again, don't watch the news, but when I've watched the news in the past, that people using their phones to record events, it's as accurate or as clear as the cameras that the cameramen normally use. So, I mean, you really and I actually saw a client of mine came in the other day with a new Google phone. It's called a Pixel. And I don't know if that thing, I mean, you could buy lenses for that to even – I don't know there's no limits what that phone could do as far as pictures go. It's amazing what the definition on that thing was.
Yeah.
So the idea of, keeping focused on our topic of imagination, the synthetic or creative, and going further into it, the imagination literally is the gateway into accessing the law of attraction.
It is. And the theory that's behind the law of attraction, that our minds actually influence what's going on in the universe, in what we call reality, that is a revolutionary concept. The combination of synthetic imagination and creative imagination are how we apply that concept. So that's one of the reasons I get so excited about learning creative imagination and learning how to apply it more, because I figure this is part of how I learn to manifest what Mike Dooley says, manifest our thoughts becoming things, and to do it regularly and intentionally, and to gain more and more control over it over time, because that's where the fun is. We are creative beings. That's really our best purpose for being here, to create.
Well, and that's where you look at humanity and you look at what we're doing, and I can I forget who the quote was, but it was somebody in the turn of the century when it went into 1900, and they were talking about patents, and they wanted to create patents to protect rights, and I forget the guy who said, he said, well, you can pass that law if you want, but everything that's been invented has about been invented already.
Yeah.
That's true. That's true.
And 116 years later, look at how much it has expanded.
Yeah, and I mean, so the idea that but he believed that. He really believed that concept, that there's not much more to do. And there's been more invented in the last 10 years than everything in history up to that point.
Yeah, that's true.
And even back when we thought we were really doing well at 2000, you're like, okay, wow, we're really almost here now. Well, look where we're at right now. I have all kinds of crazy devices in my house, and I love to, I have an Echo, and I have a Google Home, and I see which one I like better. I mean, yes, I know that everybody's listening to everything I say and recording it forever, but I don't really care. It's amazing that we have access to all this stuff. I'm fascinated by it. And I think that within your imagination, I'm also feeling a certain way about things, like loving the fact that your imagination is vibrant. Your imagination can be your reality if you use it well enough.
The thing that goes along with that, of course, is that the process hasn't slowed down. If anything, it's speeding up. So right now we're seeing what they call smart houses, right? And we're seeing the current edge, the leading edge, if you will, of the technological growth. I don't know how long it's going to be, but I would say a relatively short period of time in the future, we're going to reach a point where you don't even have to go through the steps of tying all those devices together in your house. You simply say, hey, house computer, tie them all together for me, and it does it. That's it. It's voice command. In fact, people who have sweated over remote controls on televisions and so forth, well, that'll go away because all you have to do is say, hey, TV, turn yourself on and play for me It's a Wonderful Life. And it just does it.
Well, and we're pretty much there. My Google Home box, or whatever you call that thing, it did. I had to configure it. When you turn it on, it reached out everything that was Bluetooth, and it said, "Do you want me to unite with this or connect with this?" Yes, 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 yes. I can go downstairs, and I can say, "Turn on Netflix," and it will turn on the TV. I turn on YouTube. Turn on Sports Center on ESPN. I can do any of that stuff. It automatically turns on the TV and adjusts the cable box where it needs to be, or it loads YouTube on my TV where I can watch my motivational stuff. If I want a certain song, all I got to do is say play it. It's there. I mean, what time is it? How far it is? It's tied into my calendar. It reminds me you need to leave in 10 minutes to make it to the office in time to meet with so and so. It's pretty amazing already, and we're in the infancy of that.
That's right. We are in the infancy of it. And now tie all this together to what we talked about earlier, which is the experience of kids growing up today and how they're connected through their devices. They're connected online, and they're able to access information that you and I, when we were growing up, couldn't have fathomed being able to access. Well, they can access it instantly. Well, when you combine that with the power of synthetic imagination, that creates unbelievable possibilities for future creation. And then add in the potential for creative imagination. All I can say is 25 years from now, I can barely imagine what it's going to be like, because the amount of growth that's going to happen over the next 25 years is more than my little brain can handle. I really believe that I was born at the exact right time to be able to experience. I love the fact that I have all of this information available to me. The fact that we can study the way we study, that I'm always thirsty for knowledge. People laugh at me all the time. And some of the stuff I study, like I studied the concepts of fish oil and the various esters within fish oil, and I know more about fish oil than almost anybody you'll ever meet. And there's so much, it goes way beyond what I ever really wanted to know about fish oil. But you're still able to use it and synthesize it. I mean, if I asked you right now, yes, what's the best thing you've learned so far about fish oil? What would you say?
The effects it has on the positive effects it has on the brain, in the hormonal system. It has an amazing effect. It's lacking in so many people. And fish oil is EPA. It's a good fat. The EPA and DHA are the fat, the esters within the fat, which really are building blocks that most people don't get enough of. That's why I believe we have a lot of brain conditions, brain issues, because a lot of people are deprived of these natural fats, and your brain is made up of these fats. And that's amazing to me.
And that's pretty cool. Look there are people 30 years ago who would have gone to school to get advanced degrees just so they could write down what you said.
Right. Right, and that's the point where, and I think that the idea that it freaks a lot of people out because the knowledge that we spend, like the way we're learning, like a doctor friend of mine said, medical school needs to change and not focus on. We don't need to memorize all the bones in the body anymore. We don't need it because it's all right. It's all easily available.
Which is very much of a relief to me because I haven't memorized them yet, so I'm behind the curve.
Yeah, and his point was we should be thinking more how to think medically in a healing perspective than focused on so much. He said because everything is so accessible now. It used to be. You went into the doctor and you had to describe everything. He relied on everything he learned in medical school to say, okay, well, you probably have strep throat. Well, right now, he said, all you have to do, he said, when I could type in all these symptoms, and he said, I can say, yes, it's let's start with the obvious. It's probably strep throat. Well, I got a strep test. We can do it now. Okay, it's not strep throat. So let's step down to that next level. What would that be? Boom, 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 boom. And we can keep eliminating, but all that stuff is available readily. Medical school needs to change what they're teaching because they're wasting their time on readily available information.
Yes.
And that's a really good thing. And a little further down in the chapter, this exercise I've actually done when things were really rough for me. And I found this shockingly effective.
Okay.
It says, what would you do? What would I do if I had $1 million?
Mm.
And
that's a game a lot of us have played at various times, but it's a good game.
It's a good game. And taking that game even further is I challenge people to say, I told this one guy that actually this last week, I said, how much money do you have in your pocket? He pulled out his wallet and he said, I have $123. I said, okay, I want you to spend $100 100 times today. And he said, what do you mean by that? I said, well, don't actually spend it, but I want you to, he had some free time. I said, I want you to go over to the nicer mall and I want you to spend, try to spend $10,000 today, mentally. Walk into look at this thing and say, oh, I want to buy that. And first of all, try to do it. It's hard. It's harder to do than you realize. I mean, unless you're buying a car or something. But buying a lot of stuff, it's hard to spend $10,000 a day. And I said, I want you to spend $10,000 a day mentally for 5 straight days. And he laughed at that concept, but he didn't have a lot going on, and so he's been waiting. He had several interviews where we're waiting for things. So he went out and he started doing that. And he said, I started to feel it changed my mindset. It's like, oh yes, I'll take that Apple Watch for $1,100, or I'll take this, or I'll take that. And mentally, he started spending the money, and it did change his perspective of money. He started to believe he had the money. He said, I feel wealthier than when I started doing that because I have bought all these things. Now, he really didn't buy them, and he knows he really didn't buy them, but it felt like it. That's where the imagination is at play. That's why we encourage kids. I encourage kids all the time to use your imagination. Tell me stories. Create stories, no matter how ridiculous they are. Create them. Tell me about them. Mm-hmm. What do you envision? I encourage imagination. I know a lot of people. Oh, that's you shouldn't be thinking that way. You should think big, huge. What do you want to be?
Yeah, anybody who says that you shouldn't be thinking that way actually isn't spending enough time thinking that way.
Yeah, there's the imagination. Envision what you want. Love it. We complain a lot about things, but we complain about what we don't like. What do you want? Right. That's the beauty of it. Think about what we want. That's what, if you're not spending at least, and I don't want to put a minute number, but I like to say at least an hour a day, maybe more. What do you want? Start imagining it. Imagine that's what your life is. You'll be shocked at how quickly this works.
It does.
It's amazing.
It's crazy. Amazing. And you're also right. It becomes very hard to spend it because there's a variation on that exercise where you spend $10,000 and then the next day you mentally spend $20,000 and you keep doubling it. So the next day you have to spend $40,000, $80,000. You start getting up to the $500,000 range or whatever, and it's like you run out of ideas. Like, how many houses can I buy anyway?
and that's the thing. I want everyone to understand imagination is the law of attraction in a sense. It is the gas pedal to make it happen. And I encourage that. We've talked about vision boards. A lot of people don't like that idea, but I love vision boards and actively creating something that I'm looking at, that I'm envisioning. And the law of attraction can't work if you don't know what you want. If you don't know what it is you really want, it can't work. And your focus is on what you don't want. So all the law of attraction has to do is feeding you what you don't want, because that's where your thoughts and energies are, not what you do want.
Right. That's what we're talking about, how to switch the mindset around from lack back to thing. In other words, You said it really well just a few minutes ago. Instead of spending all this time focusing on what you don't want, how about focusing on what you do want? And that's what this money exercise is all about. The reverse money exercise, the one where you're worrying all the time about money, is the diametric opposite of what you want to do. In fact, you mentioned vision boards. One of the things that I ran into this past week, something I had not heard of before, maybe you've heard of this, but they have apparently, there are certain law of attraction people who have come up with a concept known as an intentions box. Have you heard of that?
Yes, I have.
Yeah. First time I ran into it, the intentions box is where you put in a box your intentions written down on paper, particularly those related to money. And the purpose of the intentions box is to make it an exercise where, by writing down what your intentions are about money and putting it into the box, now you no longer have to worry about it because the box is guarding it for you. It's a way of separating yourself from the worry about money, or the worry about health, or the worry about relationships, or whatever it is you're worrying about. You put down on paper what it is that you want, you put it into the intentions box, and now you don't have to worry about it because the box is going to do the worrying for you. And I thought that's a really interesting concept.
It is, and I've never actually used that or used it with anyone, but the concept's solid. And I don't want. Anything that works is all that matters. I don't get stuck on any one thing. My belief is the intentions box to me separates it too much for me.
Does it?
I want to see it. I want to feel it. But I don't necessarily feel that if I were having trouble worrying, then the intentions box would be great. I've gotten to a point. We were talking before the show about how. We start to believe in something, and it takes a while for us to really get there. And I had a situation many, many years ago that when I was early in recovery, I've shared this on the show before, but it's relevant to where we're at. And I was always fascinated by how I always seemed to have just enough money, and it always fulfilled itself at the last minute.
We talked about that before the show. Yeah,
exactly. And so there's I had a situation where I had restitution to the state of Florida for some of my stuff that I had done in my addiction. And I really believed that if I didn't pay that back, I would go to jail. Well, that's not an accurate statement now, but it seemed to me that was the way at the time. So there was that much pressure on me.
Sure.
And I'd never missed a payment. I had my rent due, and I was working very hard. I was working 3 or 4 jobs, but one of the jobs was waiting tables. Well, in Florida, the season ends. The real season of tourists is the winter. People go to Florida for the weather in the winter.
Snowbirds.
So at the end of summer, when all the kids are back in school, and I mean, there's really nothing happening in Florida, and so there's not a lot of money to be made there. So I'd made it every month, but it was in September, and it was the end of September. We're going into October, and I was busted my butt at everything I could do, but I was about $125 short of what, and that was either going to be rent or restitution, and I didn't know what to do. If I didn't pay the restitution, I really was convinced I was going to go to jail. If I didn't pay the rent, the landlord had told me, because I had bad credit, if I ever got behind on the rent, then I would not be given any leeway. So there was a real catch-22. And make a long story short, I worried about it. I even considered gambling again. I hadn't gambled in several months at that point. And I even considered that as just an opportunity, because I had almost had some of the money, but I figured winning would be another thing. I decided not to gamble.
Which is a good thing, by the way.
Beautiful thing. On the last day of the month, everything's due, and I just said I want to go to my probation officer and tell her I don't have the money, and if you got to put me in jail, that's fine. And which I realize now wouldn't be the case, but that seemed logical at the time. I got a call from the restaurant and said, look, we got a last-minute tour bus coming in. If you come in and wait tables, I guarantee you'll make $100 tonight. I'll guarantee that. Well, I might not be the 125, but I'm sure being $25 short is definitely better than being $125 short. So I laughed. I went up there and I worked really hard, had a great time. I realized I was going to probably get closer to my goal. I had to even borrow $5 to get gas to get out to the restaurant.
Wow.
By the end of the night, true story, Walt, the manager of the restaurant witnessed this. If you ever waited tables, at the end of the day, you count your money, and the difference of the money that you have in your pocket versus what you owe the restaurant is your tips. I'm counting it out in front of the manager, and I ended that night with $132, and I'm trying to remember, but it was exactly right. I even paid the guy the $5 back.
That's just amazing. I mean, it's ridiculously amazing. It is.
It's like, and our audience may be going, what's the point of that? Well, I had to get to a point where I really believed everything was going to be okay, and then I said, okay, I don't have to do it at the last minute anymore. It's going to be all right. That worry is what's creating this last minute thing, and once I got past that, that was really the last time that it was ever that close, because I really knew at that point it was going to work out. But it was the worry that kept bringing it down. As I jokingly told you earlier when we were talking, I said, well, Walt, I said, why in the movies did they're going to dismantle the bomb, and they always do it with 1 second left on the time.
Yeah, right.
Why don't they just do it? Okay, we got like 11 minutes. Okay, we're done. Okay, let's go get some coffee. I mean, it takes away that oomph. But, also that oomph for me is for some people it might be a good thing. That oomph for me is not a good thing. That's creating worry, creating that stress state, and that's not a healthy place for me.
It's not for me either. I don't think it's a healthy state for anybody. But the important thing is what you're describing in your story about how it happens. It comes at the last minute sometimes, and it can be a little bit nerve-wracking, but it happens. The thing that I was flashing back to as you were describing that is one of the earlier chapters in this book, Think and Grow Rich, where he had the poem where, I don't know if you remember, but it was the poem about how whatever it is you ask of life pays you in full, but you have to pay the price to get it. And so if you ask for a penny or you ask for $1 million, it delivers what you asked for. Now, of course, as we pointed out, you also have to believe it. And I think that was the key factor that night. You had to believe it was possible for you to at least get to $100. Right. And then the universe kind of filled in the gap for the remaining $32 that you needed.
and that's the thing. We have to – that's where the imagination is, flipping the imagination from the okay, I want to imagine it. I can feel it. But I got to make that flip to believing it. And that's where the conduit, the gas pedal is the imagination. The belief comes right within that. And that's such an important thing. The idea of visualizing, spending, and all this exciting stuff, these are all tools that are directly put us directly in that place for the law of attraction to work to our advantage. That worry, the other stuff, I'll say often here on this show and on my Facebook post, worry is simply praying for what you don't want. You're inviting what you don't want in your life when you're worried about it. We can't help but worry about things, but we get stuck within that it is such a negative feedback on everything.
What a great point. Worrying is praying for what you don't want. Yes. I mean, that really focuses it right there.
Yes, and that's what I always I see that so much. I live that so much where worry was, I come from a long line of warriors, professional warriors. We invented worrying, and the idea that I see clearly, people that worry excessively just invite, they're bringing the stuff they worry about. It's amazing.
And when we put it in that perspective, at least it gives us the incentive to say, maybe I should change my pattern about worrying. I mean, maybe I don't change that pattern right away. I wish I would. But at least now I'm open to the idea that worrying is actually working against myself. And yes, I can actually do something about that. I can change the behavior so that not only does the worry doesn't happen anymore, which feels great, but now I'm also setting myself up for success instead of for failure.
Yes. And I love that when we realize that how all this ties together, that's the answer. That's the answer we do. That's why we come on the show every week. This is about tying these pieces together and living it. Imagination, there is no law of attraction practice without imagination. It is fundamental.
It's fundamental, and like you say, we do this every week for this reason, because when we tie these concepts together in our own minds, we are training our own minds to think this way. Yes, and that's when they're there. It gets on autopilot, and everything does become easier. Everything becomes, the stress of life disappears. You don't feel like you're on this constant roller coaster. You really start to believe that the universe is working on your behalf instead of the fact that you're cursed and everything's working against you. It's weird how it's been playing out in my life recently, because I've been documenting fairly well some of the challenges I've been dealing with, particularly financially, and I've been working on this mindset thing. Amazing things happen, but the most amazing thing to me is how I flip back and forth. A lot of the time now, I am able to stay in a place where I am not thinking about the money. I'm not thinking about any of that stuff. I'm getting myself feeling good. And that's when ideas are starting to come, and that's when little things start to happen and so forth. So that's the good place to be in. And then a little while later, I find myself back in the worrying place. Like, oh, there I am again. And so now I got to get back to the place I was in. I was just there 15 minutes ago.
Yes.
So now, okay, I start applying some of the tools again, and I get myself back there, and all of a sudden I'm not worrying anymore, and I'm starting to enjoy the experience of the now and all that. And I stay there for a while, and then I slip back, and it's the oscillation, the going back and forth. That's the odd thing about this period that I'm in right now.
Yes, and it's not odd as much as it is what we do. I mean,
true.
In fact, it's the opposite of it's common.
Right.
And that's what you're trying to.
It seems uncommon because nobody ever talks about it.
Right.
The hardest part is realizing that's what everybody goes through. But you're right. It is. It's got to be common because that's the way the human mind works.
Right. When I shared the story earlier about barely making that payment of restitution and barely able to do it, once I just accepted, I got this. It's going to be okay. Quit worrying. It was the last time that it went up to the last day. It was, maybe it was 2 or 3 days before that I fulfilled everything. But, and then I got to a point where let me save up 4 or 5 months worth of stuff to pay so I'll never have to worry again. And when I got to a point where I had enough money in the bank to make 5 payments, then I never looked back.
And the funny thing is, you really had the power to stop worrying before that, but that was the way it worked best for you. So you built your own path to no longer worrying.
Right. And I had to get there myself. And that's what I'm hoping that we can help the audience do, is get there themselves by understanding the imagination is really square one with this. Imagine what you want. Try to quit focusing on what you don't want, because that's what you keep inviting. What you want, envision it, view it, think about it, create it, whatever term you need to do to get it, make it real in your head. The imagination begins it all, and that's the power of the law of attraction. And we have been conditioned to worry about or just focus on what we don't want, and that is that's the opposite of where we're at. It's exciting that we've been given this gift of imagination. You can view it. That's your reality if you allow it to be your reality.
By the way, the topic of imagination is an example of synthetic imagination. Let me tell you why I say that. Currently, law of attraction gurus pretty much start with imagination. You have to imagine the thing that you want to attract. You have to imagine the state you want to attract. You have to imagine the finances or the health or whatever it is that you want to attract. That's step 1. For Napoleon Hill, it was step number 5. This chapter is labeled the 5th step toward riches. So there's an example of how modern-day law of attraction people took the Hill concept and rearranged it and changed the order and changed how they were going to think about the same thing he talked about, but thinking about it differently and made it better.
Right. And that's all, all of this is, it's so clear and so obvious and still remains for many people a difficult thing to put together, because we're rewiring, years of thoughts, decades or generations of thoughts, if as we talked about before.
Well, hopefully we're turning that around. And unfortunately, we're out of time, so we'll have to pick it up next week. But, Joel, it's been a pleasure as usual.
Great to talk to you, my friend.
We'll see you all next time here on LOA Today. Goodbye, everybody.